speaker, Mike D'Onofrio. Mike is earned his graduate degree from Southern Illinois University. He has been employed in the Upper Great Lakes with fishery resource agencies for over 30 years and presently serves as a fisheries team supervisor in Northeast Wisconsin. And today he will be joining us to tell us a little bit more about Menominee River Lake Sturgeon restoration. And Mike, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and you are welcome to take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you to talk about two of my favorite topics, Menominee River and Lake Sturgeon. See the screen all right and hear me okay?
Looks good, Mike. Yep.
All right, thank you. So I'm a fisheries team supervisor out of Peshtigo, and my team covers the 6-county area in Northeast Wisconsin as well as Green Bay. So I was fortunate when I accepted this position in 2004 to not only be managing the fisheries of the Menominee River, but also the lake sturgeon populations in the river and Green Bay. And what I'll be talking to you today about is a very long-range project that we've been involved in for several years. And it's a story that I'll tell. And like most stories, there's beginning, middle, and end. So as background information, I want to tell the audience that there's 2 species of sturgeon that live in Wisconsin. There's the shovel-nosed sturgeon shown in the bottom image here. You can see why it's called a shovel-nosed sturgeon with that spoon-like nose for digging up in substrates. And then there's the lake sturgeon, which is more commonly known throughout the state, much larger fish. Shovel-nosed sturgeon might get mature at, about 20, 25 inches, whereas the lake sturgeon mature at a much larger size, much older fish. So here's the range in the gray area in North America of lake sturgeon. You can see it's got a very wide range covering several states, all the way down to Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, and all the way up to several Canadian provinces, including the Great Lakes and Green Bay, where Menominee River, where my focus is. So sturgeon management in the state of Wisconsin encompasses 3 major watersheds: the Mississippi River, where both shovel-nose and lake sturgeon exist, and the Lake Superior and Lake Michigan watersheds, where only lake sturgeon exists. So like many other species in the Great Lakes, when they were first exploited by commercial fishermen, obviously several decades ago. You can see this graphic goes back to 1882, and on the y-axis is numbers of fish harvested by commercial fishermen. This is the oldest I have that we have good records for the commercial fishery in the Great Lakes. And so you can see back in 1882, they harvested just under 4,000 sturgeon is what they reported at that time. And you can see that it didn't take them long to collapse that fishery. And we're going on, 120, 130 years where there's been no commercial harvest. And that lake sturgeon fishery is less than 1% of the historic population size. So it's just a dramatic increase. And it's an amazing story to tell how that species has survived at those low levels for over 100 years, not only in Lake Michigan, but the other Great Lakes. So it's an amazing story, especially considering the dams that have been built and water quality issues that have occurred on our major rivers. So the species has survived, and I would say for the last 30 years, there's been an intensive effort to try to restore that fishery in the Great Lakes and obviously Lake Michigan. So most people are familiar with lake sturgeon because of the spearing season that just concluded on the Lake Winnebago system recently in the last few weeks. So that it's an ice fishery. A lot of people recognize that a lot of large fish are harvested through the ice using a spear. And as these ladies comically say, if there's no ice, it's not nice. And on the back of their shirt, couldn't spear, so we drink beer. So it's a social event. And it's a lot of gatherings at the registration station. But what most people don't know is there's a very large also hook and line fishery In the state of Wisconsin, that occurs during basically the month of September, and it's been going on for many, many years. And the Menominee River goes back to 1946. The two states opened it up. But harvests have relatively low, unregulated with quotas, just with size limits and seasons. And here you have an image. The Winnebago system gets a lot of attention because of the large sturgeon that are harvested, but there's also very large sturgeon that exist and are harvested through hook and line. Here's the current record for hook and line class in the state of Wisconsin. You can see this fish was harvested in 1979 in Marinette County, northwest Wisconsin, Yellow Lake, 79 inches and over 170 pounds. So very large sturgeon do exist outside the Winnebago system. And believe it or not, this fish is a spawning female that was caught just a few years ago below the De Pere Dam on the Fox River. And you can see by the net there at the dip net at the base, she was in very shallow water. These young men from UW Green Bay were able to capture her and take some data and tag her just using a dip net. Obviously a very strong dip net and some very, a lot of muscles from these young men. But this fish was over 88 inches long, definitely would ellipse the hook and line class if it was harvested that way. But of course it was harvested using biological methods, but easily over 150 pounds. They didn't get a weight on it, but it's a very large fish. So they do exist. This fish would spawn in the Fox River and spend most of its life in Green Bay. So that's some background information. And what I'm going to show you now is a PowerPoint that was prepared by my colleagues in Michigan DNR, Darren Kramer and Jennifer Johnson. And since Menominee River is a boundary water, we share a lot of resources, and obviously in this way, we're sharing a presentation. You also see there's a lot of collaborators on this project over the years. Rob Elliott from Fish and Wildlife Service, Josh Raby and Dan Eisherman are professors at UW Stevens Point, and then Paul Radzikinas and Mike Kidd are with Eagle Creek Renewable Energies, the power company that I'm going to be talking about. So the Menominee River forms much of the boundary between Michigan's Upper Peninsula and Wisconsin. It's a major tributary to Lake Michigan. Historically, it was a free-flowing river from Green Bay upstream 82 miles to a natural barrier known as the Sturgeon Falls. Presently, that's the site of this dam number 6 up from Green Bay. There's actually 10 hydroelectric dams on the Menominee River to take advantage of that large river and the gradient that occurs along the watershed there. So historically, there were no dams, of course, and sturgeon were able to migrate upstream several miles. Beginning in the 1800s, associated with the logging era, there was construction of several dams occurred throughout the river, and more recently, probably since last 100 years or so, there's been hydroelectric dams that have been built on the river. So the first dam is located near the mouth in the cities of Marinette in Wisconsin and Menominee, Michigan. It's only 2.5 miles from the mouth. And as I mentioned earlier, the lake sturgeon population is relatively small compared to historic numbers. So this graphic, I'll focus in on the image on the right first. And what you're seeing here is in green, those dots represent known spawning populations of lake sturgeon in the Lake Michigan Basin, and the blue dots are presumed historic distribution, which we haven't been able to document any sturgeon in those systems spawning at this point. The numbers that are associated next to each river is the size of the spawning population. You can see very small spawning populations in several rivers. And if you look at the pie chart on the left there, you'll see that all those rivers in Lake Michigan Basin, the 4 rivers in Green Bay, the large rivers, the Menominee, Peshtigo, and Fox, account for maybe 75 to 80% of all the spawning sturgeon in the Lake Michigan Basin. And to give you an idea, that's about 3,000 adults And for scale, the population in the Winnebago system is far larger at 40,000 fish. So that was the spawning population numbers. Over the years, we've been tagging Lake Sturgeon in the Menominee system for over 50 years now, and we have some very good population estimates of the fish over 36 inches, which would include the adults as well as the subadults. So you see the population is larger, obviously, when you include the subadults. So the population segment for the first 2.5 miles of the river, including those fish that would be in Green Bay, would be just under 2,000, 701 for the next stretch of river, 1895 for the third stretch, and then 405 for the uppermost area that goes all the way up to Sturgeon Falls. So what happened is that historically the population was so large in the Menominee River that as those dams were built, there were resident sturgeon that were living in the river year-round, and as those dams were built, those fish became trapped, and they couldn't migrate upstream because of the dams, but they could go downstream in high water events when the dam gates were open. So so the populations between White Rapids and Grand Rapids Dam and Grand Rapids and Park Mills Dam are resident fish, whereas that population between Sturgeon Falls and Chalk Hills Dam is a stock population that we're trying to restore over the last almost 40 years now. So much smaller population. But anyways, there's some resident fish already there, and they've been able to persist for over 100 years because the habitat is there. And we know the habitat is there because of graduate student Dan Doherty, who collected some data on the Menominee River and evaluated sturgeon habitat in the early 2000s. And Dan did that by the old method of transects across several sections of the river, looking at substrate size and distribution, as well as flow, to assess and develop some estimates of spawning habitat in the river. So if you look at the inset there where it shows the lower river, those lower 2.5 miles, it's highly industrialized with paper mills and other industries. So the spawning habitat is smaller than the upriver habitat. So you got a little over 100 square meters below the first dam, whereas if you look above the first dam, if we can get sturgeon into that 20-mile section plus section of river between the second and third dams, you double the amount of spawning habitat, which obviously would be ideal. Even more so, it's more dramatic when you look at the juvenile rearing habitat. And again, you got about 800 square meters of habitat below downstream of the first dam compared to over 6.5 million square meters. And you can see by the color indication is yellow for most of the river between the second and third dam. It's a lot of rock and sand, which is ideal juvenile rearing habitat, and would be excellent if we can get sturgeon up into that area where they historically spawned when they were migrating upstream from Green Bay. So again, the lower river is 2.5 miles of river. If we can get fish above there, they can utilize habitat of over 20 miles of river, both for spawning and nursery habitat. So the big thing is, how do we make that happen? And let me tell you, it's a very long process to make that happen. And I'll tell you that story right now in a condensed version. And what ultimately led to was the implementation team, which I've been a member of since I started with this agency in 2004. So within a few weeks of starting this job, I actually attended the very first meeting at the DNR Service Center in Peshtigo here in October of 2004. And we met for 9 years, at least quarterly, sometimes bi-monthly meetings to talk about a plan on how we're going to implement fish passage around the lower two dams on the Menominee River. Obviously a very long process with a lot of dedicated people, and not only from the agencies, but from non-profit groups like the River Alliance of Wisconsin, as well as the power company was obviously an extremely important partner, and they were interested not only because they were initially, the agencies forced them and the federal government to implement fish passage or talk about fish passage and eventually implement it, but it was also linked to their license, and it was a strong incentive if they kind of fought us on this license that the agencies would come down pretty hard on them to implement fish passage, again, because it's so important. We had a lot of background information with the size of the population, the importance of the Menominee River, as well as the amount of habitat. So over several years, like I told you, we went to multiple meetings and we looked at several different designs on how we can implement fish passage around these two dams on the Menominee River. Ultimately, we came up with a fish elevator design that I'm going to show you and also show a couple of short videos on, where we capture fish, sort the fish, and transport only sturgeon upstream, not only of the Menominee Dam, but the second dam, the Park Mill Dam, which I'll show you in subsequent images. And then downstream passage occurs either through high water events when the gates are open, but when low water events, the gates are closed, and we built some chutes or flumes inside the dams that fish always have access to during the open water months. So not surprising, very large and expensive project. That always was a hang up with the power company, very understandable for them. So Eagle Creek is the power company. They invested over $3 million of their funds towards the project, and GLRI is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, a federal initiative that we were able to get over $6 million towards the project. So obviously a $9 million project. The second bullet there refers to how Eagle Creek is ultimately responsible for maintaining as well as operating the lift for the next 50 years of their license. So they have funds set aside internally to pay for those expenses. Fortunately for the Wisconsin DNR, Michigan is where the powerhouse is located. As you see on this image here, on the right is Michigan, and on the left is Wisconsin and Marinette, Wisconsin. So the powerhouse is located on the Michigan side of the river. Fortunately, Michigan DNR was willing to operate, and they are paid by Eagle Creek to operate the lift both in the spring and the fall. So looking at this image here, downstream, so to the bottom of this image would be Green Bay, 2.5 miles for a fish to swim up. This is the first obstacle they encounter is the Menominee Dam. And then the second obstacle is just a mile upstream is the Park Mill Dam. So what we intended to do was upstream would be through a fish lift and sorting facility located inside the powerhouse of the Menominee Dam, shown by the green arrows, and then we're going to transport the fish above the Park Mill Dam with a truck and trailer. Downstream would occur as shown by the red arrows through flumes located both at the Park Mill Dam and the Menominee Dam. So believe it or not, it was like those days, I date myself, but the old erector set days where you kind of build this, they literally were lucky they had some empty turbine bays from this historic dam on the Menominee River that was built about 100 years ago. So, and they had, so we're able to build this fish lift tower, which is over 34 feet tall. So they put a hole in the roof, and then through a crane, they were able to construct this iron structure inside the building. You can see it's composed of a hopper shown by the two gentlemen on the right. The photo there, the hopper is very large, about 10 feet across and 15 feet deep, and it's up to 3 feet deep with water. So obviously a very large lift to be able to lift that amount of water all the way up to the sorting tanks for fish to get sorted. So now, fingers crossed here, I was very fortunate to I'm usually not there. They've operated the lift a couple thousand times, and I've probably been there for maybe 10 to 20 times when they've operated the lift. And I happened to be there in the fall of 2019 when they were operating the lift, and they had these number of fish inside. So they're Michigan DNR Jennifer Johnson, you'll see her in the second video here, is operating the lift, and I'm just standing there observing it, obviously shooting video with my smartphone. And you never know what you're going to pick up. And it was just very lucky that I was there on this day when we lifted up the elevator, and there were these 12 adult sturgeon in there. Obviously, the crew gets very excited to see these. They'll be involved in a lot of work to process these fish. Average size of these fish is easily 50 inches. There's definitely some smaller fish in there, probably fish up to 60 inches. But in general, we've always seen that the population is, the average size is 50 inches. So the lift is coming up from the river bottom, and they're lifting it all the way up to the level of the sorting tank. I would say maybe 15 feet or so. So they'll stop here, and this video will end, and then I'll show them emptying the tank, the hopper into the sorting tank. So it'll end here in a few seconds. So here's the next short video. There's Jennifer Johnson, a biologist with Michigan DNR, operating the lift. And here's the sorting tank in front of you. And you're going to see the fish and the tank being emptied and all the fish going into the sorting tank. So you can see the hopper has continued to be lifted up. Once it engages, then it's going to open up and allow the water to escape from the hopper as well as the fish. And there's always one last thing. Here we come. And with the tip of the tail, there we go. Very successful lift. So that's the process of lifting the elevator, and then the hard work comes into play and processing all those fish. You can see in the various images there that all the fish are handled, all the lake sturgeon are handled. We get length up, recorded off those fish. We also measure the girth, the widest area of the fish, so we can get an estimate of weight. We take a tissue sample for genetic analysis later on. PIT tag stands for PIC, obviously PIC, the passive integrated transponder tag. It's the same tag that a vet uses to tag a dog or cat. So we've placed those, and I have a record, probably 20,000 sturgeon in the Green Bay and Menominee Rivers. And then a few of the fish get acoustic tags, so we can look at their behaviors post transport upstream. Obviously, when we are operating this lift, it's subject to catching any fish that's in the Menominee River, so we get a lot of good information from the bycatch. We identify those to species, take a total length, and then we take the age structure. All that helps us to manage those other fish populations. But the only fish that's passed upstream is lake sturgeon. Everything else is passed back downstream after the process. So the lift began operation in 2014. There's spring and fall operations. It's right in the implementation or the operations plan for this lift that the power company has to allow us to operate it up to 12 weeks a year, up to 6 in the spring and 6 in the fall. You can see that Derek's in the center image there in the sorting tank. I see a kind of an overhead view. You've already seen how the fish get into the sorting tank. And then there's you can see a large channel that can direct the fish into 2 holding tanks, very large holding tanks. Those tanks are 12 feet in diameter and about 3.5 feet deep. So we can hold several sturgeon while we process them and hold them until they're transported upstream. So really well-designed facility, and that's worked out really well for everybody to be able to move these fish. And then in the lower right image there is the 3-foot diameter black plastic tube, which is used for draining all the tanks as well as returning fish back down to the Menominee River that we aren't passing upstream. So we do have criteria for moving sturgeon upstream. All the fish are visually inspected to make sure they appear to be in good physical condition. They don't have any open wounds like this fish shown in the bottom image there, where it's got some very bad wounds. We don't want to pass that fish upstream, as well as looking for any diseases. There's a disease that we're familiar with that's visible on the outside. It's got those white marks that we've seen in spawning sturgeon in the springtime only, and it's not present in the upriver fish. So we obviously don't want to introduce that disease upstream, so those fish are pushed back downstream. And AIS stands for aquatic invasive species, such as lamprey. We don't want to pass any fish that have any aquatic invasive species upstream. The criteria also is for females is the fish have to be over 50 inches. We've never seen a sturgeon under 50 inches in the Green Bay Menominee rivers that's been a spawning condition, and males tend to be a little bit smaller, 5 inches smaller at 45 inches. So only sturgeon females over 50 inches and males over 45 are passed upstream. Our target goals is like about 2-to-1 male to female ratio. And initially we all agreed that we're going to take this slowly and only pass about 90 sturgeon upstream. You can see that in the upcoming graphics that we're passing more than that upstream based on some great results we're having. So of course, some obvious questions come to mind. Is it working? You know, are the sturgeon we're passing upstream staying there for at least one spawning season? These fish spawn in the spring, usually April, May. And what is the most efficient way to operate the lift? So fortunately, we got a great partner in UW-Stevens Point and a couple of professors there, primarily Dan Eiserman and Josh Robbie, and they've been involved in the project for several years. So the first graduate student was Josh Schulte, and what Josh looked at was post-passage behavioral study, where he put transmitters in sturgeon and looked at their movements upstream. The results are very encouraging, that 85% of the sturgeon migrated upstream rapidly and remained there for one spawning season, regardless of the season, whether we passed them in the fall and they had to spend the whole winter upstream, or whether we passed them in the spring, which was maybe days to weeks before they started to spawn. It also wasn't dependent on sex of the fish or size of the fish. Overall, 85% of the fish remained upstream for one spawning event after they were passed above the lower two dams. And also, you know, the fish were able to migrate back downstream. We know that through some telemetry as well as some tagging, that the fish are doing very well in surviving back. We've even had some fish that have returned and we passed them upstream in this short amount of time a couple times. So the fish are surviving and doing well after they've been through this ordeal of being handled and gone upstream and spawned and came back down. So that answered the first question. You know, the fish that we pass upstream, 85% of them, that's great results, are staying up there for a spawning event. The next thing was operating the lift in the most efficient manner. So the second student, Nick Porter at Stevens Point under Josh Robbie, looked at various factors to try to best and most efficiently operate this lift, not only from our staff time, but from the power company standpoint. We don't want to operate it there for 6 weeks if we don't have to, and we can meet our goals in a shorter amount of time. So what we did was looked at the best time of day to operate the lift: morning, afternoon, evening, overnight. We broke it up into a random start and 7-hour shifts. We also looked at environmental factors that occurred during those events. Number 3, we looked at different attraction flows, anywhere from 40 to 120 cubic feet per second. If you want to think about cubic feet per second, think of a soccer or basketball, and 40 of those passing through some orifice per second, or up to 120. And then item number 4 is how long should you have the lift on the bottom of the substrate floor? So they experimented with times all the way from 15 minutes to 120 minutes, and also left the lift overnight to see if that would factor. Now, one of the things, if you looked at the lift, there's no way of kind of funneling the fish in there so they can freely enter and leave as long as it's on the bottom. So that's therefore We have some cameras, but just because you see fish in there and you close the gate down doesn't mean you captured those fish. So we wanted to look at the most efficient way. Not surprising that, well, maybe it is surprising, but for us, it wasn't convenient to operate during our work hours. The best time the fish wanted to utilize it was during the evening. They also found that spring temperatures had to reach 55 degrees. In the fall, we tend to operate it just around Labor Day in September. Flow rates, not surprising. The highest flow rates had the best, were best for attracting sturgeon, as well as the lift time would be 60 to 120 minutes of soak time, as we would call it, was best for operating the lift most efficiently. So this graphic on the y-axis on the left is the numbers of fish from 0 to 250, and on the x-axis you can see we've only been operating the lift for a short period of time. And over these 5 years, we've become, or I should say it's a broad we, Michigan DNRs become more efficient at operating the lift. Initially, the first year, they captured 45, and last full year of operation, 2019, they captured 230. So they're becoming much more efficient at capturing fish. And then, like I said, based on those criteria I showed you earlier, not all the sturgeon that are captured are moved upstream. So initially it was 25 fish were moved upstream in 2015. And in 2019, there was 147 adult sturgeon that were moved upstream. The size of the fish that are captured, like I said, the surveys we've been doing for many decades, the average size of the fish is 50 inches, but of course you're going to catch some smaller fish down to 19 inches in this case, and larger fish up to 75 inches. So the last full cycle that we have that I'm going to show you in this graphic that we operated the lift was in the fall of 2019. It was started just before Labor Day. We actually, the first years we started it at Labor Day to try to get the temperatures down. But then we knew sturgeon were residing there in late August. And as long as the temperatures were lower than 70, we'll go ahead and handle those fish, the water temperatures. So that year we began on August 26th. We caught 163 sturgeon in a couple-week period. When it says 96% were new fish, meaning fish that hadn't been captured early before that year. So that's a good sign, gives you an idea that there's several fish milling around, so to speak, below the dam. And it meant that 2-to-1 ratio of 67% were male and 33% were female. They captured 163, but only transferred 87 upstream. And 20 of those were implanted with acoustic tags. We also it was our first time that we operated a new trailer that was specifically designed for moving the fish above the lower 2 dams. Prior to that, we had cattle tanks in the back of a pickup truck. Wasn't the best for the fish, a lot of lifting going on and more stressful for the fish. So this is much better. The other thing that happened in the fall of 19 was we had our second tour of the facility. A lot of the public is certainly aware with newspaper articles that what's going on here, but they can't see it because it's all indoors. So we were able to offer some public tours. We were all involved in being there to show the public what's going on inside the building and what's ultimately been done with all those dollars that have been investing into this project. So a couple photos showing the sturgeon trailer. So if you start with the upper left image there, Jennifer has grabbed one of the sturgeon in the holding tank and she's sluicing it down. And then in the next image in the upper right there, Mike Kidd is grabbing that fish and putting it inside the trailer. The trailer in the lower left, it's got covers on it, and we back it up into the boat ramp. And rather than, again, trying to minimize lifting any fish and stress, it's got a hydraulic lift in it that lowers it right down into the water column. And then Mike Kidd from the power company go ahead and lifts the gate up and then lifts each one of those slotted dividers and allows the fish to freely swim out. Not surprising, they'd rather be out in the river than stuck in the tank. So they freely swim out of the tank. Handle maybe 8 to 10 adults per trip in that tank. Not surprising, you know, like I said, there's a lot of bycatch that goes on, 17 to 24 species during each lift season, representative of the fish that are found in the Menominee River. You know, the most common fish that we see is rock bass, followed by white sucker, and then a lot of variety of other species depending on the time of year, spring versus fall. You can see rainbow trout, smallmouth bass, walleye, black crappie, brown trout, bullhead, scar. Anything that's in the river is subject to being captured. And like I said earlier, those fish are processed and returned back downstream. So we get lengths and age structures, all those off of all those fish. And it's really been a great asset to get that information without having to electrofish or set nets in the lower river. You get a lot of good data from those other species. So what are the next steps? So we've shown that the fish we move upstream stay upstream for a spawning event. We know that they come back down safely. We know the best methods to operate the lift, most efficiently operate the lift. Well, the next thing we want to look at is, are the fish that we're moving upstream actually spawning? But before I say that, I guess I got ahead of myself here. So next steps, actually what we did was the tagging methods we've employed, we have those pit tags that we're putting inside sturgeon. So inside the two flumes, we've put these frame antennas to detect sturgeon. I got one more slide after this to show that. And then the other thing is we're continuing, Fish and Wildlife Service purchased 80 more of these acoustic tags. It costs about $350 a piece. We have several receivers in the upper river and lower river, as well as Green Bay, that we're able to monitor movements of those fish after we transport them upstream. So here's a slide I inserted here. It's a downstream flume on the Park Mill Dam. There's a notch we cut in the concrete and slid this frame that's about 3 feet wide and about 5 feet tall into the downstream flume, and then they don't show it there, but there'll be wires hooked up here and run to this control box that is mounted on the railing there. You can see the wires coming in. There's ground wires, the thinner one, and the power cable, and the connection to the frame antenna. What's amazing about this technology is it's monitoring activity, any tagged fish that goes through this frame antenna 24/7. And I can look at it remotely from my desk. I get emails a couple times a day letting me know that the antenna is working properly. You can see I can look at both the Menominee Dam flume or the Park Mill Dam and pull up that data to make sure it's operating correctly and any fish that have been detected since the last time I looked at it. Download that information in my computer for further analysis. It'll show me the tag number, and then I can look up that fish to see when it was handled, the size, and other information. So it's a great resource to have. And we have those at both of the dams and the downstream flumes. So now I get to the next step. So what we have is, again, we want to know if those fish are actually spawning and recruiting lake sturgeon to the upper Menominee and ultimately to Green Bay. We have a project that's going on right now, run for a few more years, $300,000 grants, 2 grants from the federal government, the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act, and the second one is from We Energies, who owns several of the dams in the upper Menominee River watershed. So we're able to get some funding. 2 universities involved, UW Green Bay and Stevens Point, as well as Michigan State University. Dr. Kim Scribner is analyzing the fish tissue. So we're able to do some parentage studies. It's pretty amazing technology using DNA. So we have tissue samples. We've analyzed all the genetic markers from all the adults that we've moved upstream, and we can capture larvae and juvenile fish and see if we can trace those back to their parents, whether their parents are fish that we moved upstream or resident fish that live between those dams. And unfortunately, I don't have any data to share right now. The data is being analyzed. We'll have some results later this year on the first year sampling in 2020. So the grant goals are to determine the proportional contribution, like I said, of a past lake sturgeon to annual recruitment between the Park Mill and Grand Rapids sections of the Menominee River, and evaluate, like scientists like to do, evaluate timing or passage, sex versus size, age of the fish passed, and the number of passed fish as it related to the success and proportional contribution to annual reproduction. So it'll be a great end to kind of our project to hopefully prove, and cross our fingers, that once again we're successful, and these fish that we know we're passing have viable eggs. They're mature fish that they are successfully spawning, and their young are hatching out, which we already know is occurring in smaller numbers at below that third dam, the Grand Rapids Dam. And that's my last slide. Entertain any questions. I'm very dry mouth.
No, that was fantastic, Mike. Thank you so much. I wasn't aware I was going to be learning about a sturgeon elevator when I woke up this morning. That was,
No.
was truly amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's a very incredible project. It's a very rare project in the United States. It's really been thrilling to be involved.
Absolutely. So we got about 4 minutes left, and we have 2 questions. Kind of getting into that, how huge an undertaking this is. Can you speak a little more on the roles of the cooperating agencies? Who's doing monitoring, restoration design, installation, funding? And this attendee wanted to know if Marinette County Conservation was involved in this at all.
Now, to answer the last question first, Marinette County Conservation, the counties aren't involved, the cities aren't involved. It's the resource agencies. It's really, Michigan DNR is really taking the lead. They're doing most of the work. We're certainly supporting them, the other agencies. And then the power company is stepping up, not only with labor, but funds to operate the lift.
Excellent. And then the other question kind of focuses on, once those fish are upstream, how are they passing back downstream? And specifically, is there any concern about risk to the sturgeon being impacted by dam turbines, or how are they successfully getting back down the river after they've been transported upriver?
Sure, and I should have focused on that, but what happened is part of the design in the downstream passage was they have racks for allowing water to go through, and keep out a lot of the debris. So what we made them do is narrow the spacing on that trash rack down to 1.5 inches at Park Mill Dam, and closest to the downstream plume, it's 1 inch spacing on that rack. So obviously adult fish can't get in between there, and we narrowed the spacing on that rack as much as possible to allow for them to operate that power dam, but obviously to block out those juvenile sturgeon that we think are going to be coming down at probably 8 inches, we're hoping, or 9 inches. So that's what we've done to kind of exclude them from those turbines.
Excellent, absolutely. Maybe time for one more. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the criteria used to determine which fish you are passing upstream? I know you talked a little bit about not wanting to move invasive species or certain diseases or viruses, but those sizes, is it just to maximize reproduction upriver?
Yep, that's the whole goal. We could move all the sturgeon upstream, but we wanted to just focus on the spawning size sturgeon, so that's why we went with the larger fish. And then I didn't mention it, it was shown in the image, all the fish that we pass upstream are ultrasound to not only determine that they're males versus female, but also know that their ovaries are fully developed and their testes are fully developed, that they are going to spawn when we move them upstream. So they're all evaluated, all those images are saved, and a lot of publications are going to be coming out on this great data.
Yeah. Well, that gets us to our time. Mike, thank you so much for sharing this information about a project to protect some amazing fish in Wisconsin. I really appreciate it.
Yep, thank you, Luke, and thanks everybody for participating, and get back to me in an email if you want any more information.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Absolutely, thank you. And to everyone watching, we will be taking a short 15-minute break. We will be coming back right at 10 a.m. to hear from Brad Sims about some interesting fish fauna of the lower Wisconsin riverway system. And then we'll have John Lyons joining us at 11 a.m. this morning to talk about some invasive species in Wisconsin. So if you're interested in that ongoing battle with invasive species, I encourage you to join us then. And with that, thank you all for joining us so far, and hopefully we'll see some of you back at 10 a.m. Thank you.